おじいさんのアニメクラブ
Welcome everyone to episode 4 of OG-san's Anime Club. I am OG-san, and I'm glad you're here with me today to discuss some real cool topics in the world of anime. We're going to explore a new format for the show by starting with some news that may be of interest since the previous episode, and then get into our usual style of segments about anime. Here are today's topics.
1
Extra, extra! Since I went long on the other segments today, the news since episode 3 gets its own slot, and there's plenty that's worth discussing.
2
Apothecary Diaries Season 1 was a huge hit in the fall 2023 season, and I've prepared a spoiler-free segment all about it.
3
In 1992, we got an OVA that rocked VCRs around the globe and impacted the future of anime that followed it. In segment 3, we dive deep into Tenchi Muyo Ryo-Ohki. Let's begin.
レッツゴー
Alright, I'm gonna blast through some news real quick because I can't wait to discuss the aforementioned titles, but a lot has happened since we last spoke. Please seek out the trailers and VODs of what I'm about to discuss, and feel free to send me your thoughts about them to ogsansanimeclub@gmail.com. You never know, you might get a response in a future video. First up, the One Piece remake from Studio Wit released its first trailer and is set to release in February 2027. Available on Netflix, it will consist of 7 episodes totaling 5 hours, and will be adapting the first 50 chapters of the manga by Ichiro Oda. According to an article on GamesRadar.com, the president of Studio Wit gave a few reasons why One Piece is getting a remake, even though it's still currently airing with a tally of 1,168 episodes as of this recording. George Wada expressed that the old 4:3 screen ratio was a major stumbling block for a new generation of viewers, and also that the goal is for the One Piece to have flawless pacing. My personal opinion as a longtime One Piece fan is that the filler in the show is actually pretty palatable in comparison to other shonen titles that were infected with notoriously pointless filler. I also believe that the show is, in fact, far too long and have no problem agreeing with people I recommend it to, telling me that that's the main deterrent for them. I've been on the cruise since I read my first chapter of it in the March 2003 US Shonen Jump magazine, so I'm not about to jump ship, but I am excited for the next generation of fans who get to experience what I can safely say is a life-changing story to consume. Did you watch the new trailer? What did you think? Next up, Mappa Studios celebrated its 15th anniversary with an awesome live event streamed on YouTube. If you're a fan of the studio and missed it, definitely check out the replay. The event announced an anime adaptation of Jimoto Psycho, the International Assassins arc of Chainsaw Man, Season 4 or Calling Games Part 2 of Jujutsu Kaisen, Season 3 of Dorohedoro, Season 3 of the Ranma 1/2 remake, which in my personal opinion was the most entertaining panel of all, and Season 2 of Oblivion Battery. There was also a retrospective interview with some of those involved with Attack on Titan, but it's full of spoilers, so make sure you're current before watching it. Overall, this was a pretty cool event, and I'd love to see more things like this from other studios. Which announcement has you the most excited? Finally, for news on this episode, Crunchyroll released its 2026 summer anime preview, and more news dropped for other distributors as well. Coming in the first week of July, we'll get to see Black Torch, and Prime Video will be streaming the Ghost in the Shell reboot worldwide. We'll be continuing the Double Core series from the spring 2026 season as well. Clevitas gets a second season, and Asahi Production will be releasing Dara-san of Reiwa. For fans of anime with short titles, you can also look forward to one called From Overshadowed to Overpowered, Second Reincarnation of a Talentless Sage from EMT Squared. There are quite a few more shows announced for the summer 2026 anime season, which is just around the corner, so I invite you to check out the official releases and tell me what's on your watch list. Personally, I was stoked to watch the adaptation of Smoking Behind the Supermarket with You after reading some of the manga when it was first coming out. You can watch a good chunk of the mini-episodes on Crunchyroll right now ahead of the official July 9th release. And with that, I think that it's time that we go ahead and get into the segments. If any of that news got you wanting to say something, go ahead and comment to get a conversation started. This is an anime club after all. For now, let's talk about Apothecary Diaries.
おじいさんのアニメクラブ
Okay, I admit it. I slept on Apothecary Diaries, and I made a huge mistake by doing so. Recently, I just finished Season 1 of this show after hearing it lauded by so many people during the 2026 Crunchyroll Anime Awards. Through the smiles, I could feel the love of the character Mao Mao every time that she got brought up. So when I could find a little time when I was on vacation recently, I decided to give season 1 a shot. What ended up happening was that I was completely hooked and could barely stand it to wait until the next available evening that I could watch what Mao Mao was getting into. I'm going to make this segment as spoiler-free as possible, but considering the show ended 2 years ago, I feel okay with taking a few liberties for the sake of properly expressing the emotions that watching certain scenes elicited. I think season 1 of Apothecary Diaries is a fantastic show to watch, but considering some of the themes in the show regarding prostitution, courtesans, murder, and suicide, I don't feel comfortable recommending it to young adults or anyone who experiences difficulty with such subjects. Please use your best judgment when deciding to watch this show for yourself. Let's begin by discussing the history of this show. Season 1 of Apothecary Diaries premiered in the fall 2023 anime season with 3 episodes, and ran continuously with 21 more episodes through March 2024 as a 2-core production. In case you don't remember, some of the other competition this show had in that season was Frieren Beyond Journey's End, Season 2 of Spy X Family, Shangri-La Frontier, a Goblin Slayer sequel, and MF Ghost. Before becoming an anime, Apothecary Diaries was a web novel. First published on the Japanese fiction website Shosetsuki ni Naro in 2011, Natsu Hyuga's web novel eventually led to a print novel edition, a professionally illustrated light novel series, and multiple manga adaptations before being animated. The Hiro Bunko light novel edition of Apothecary Diaries began publication in 2014, and features illustrations by Toko Shino that help define Mao Mao's modern visual identity. Though I've not read all the adaptations preceding the anime, it appears that the anime primarily adapts this light novel version as opposed to the original web novel. Interestingly, there are 2 manga adaptations that are both still ongoing. This kind of information is the stuff that really catches my interest. Square Enix is releasing a version in monthly Big Gangan with art by Neko Kurage and story by Itsuki Nanao, and Shogakukan is publishing another version in monthly Sunday Gene X with art by Minoji Kurata. As of November 2025, there have been 16 volumes of the Square Enix manga, and Shogakukan's adaptation, titled Mao Mao's Notes on the Inner Palace, has reached 22 published volumes as of June 2026. First airing on Nippon TV in October 2023, the television adaptation was a collaboration between Toho Animation Studio and OLM, or Oriental Light and Magic, and takes place in a fictional empire inspired by Imperial China, where a young apothecary named Mao Mao is unexpectedly thrust into the secluded world of the Emperor's inner palace. When examining the targeted demographics of this show, looking at the manga magazines that influenced this adaptation, one could surmise that Apothecary Diaries is seinen, but I can't help but feel some shoujo elements from it. Perhaps what kept me so interested in the show is that it felt like a romance anime when it never explicitly was a romance. There is an underlying sense of romance that remained unrequited but could hardly be denied by the viewer, and was made even more interesting by the fact that one of the main characters is a eunuch. But no, I think it would be more accurate to describe this show as part Sherlock Holmes mystery, part historical court drama, and part medical procedural. Mao Mao is the unlikely protagonist who rules out possibilities, diagnoses uncomfortable realities, and reluctantly changes her life in the process. Armed with an encyclopedic knowledge of medicine, herbs, and poisons, coupled with an insatiable curiosity about such things, she begins solving strange illnesses, suspicious incidents, and other mysteries that could be easily overlooked as unfortunate accidents. What starts as a series of seemingly isolated cases gradually reveals a world where medicine and politics are deeply intertwined. Mao Mao is a staple in the pleasure district, being raised by an expert apothecary eunuch and befriended by everyone at one of the most famous brothels in the district. She seems quite understated, generally unmoved by anything but her desire to learn more about herbs and poisons, often testing them on herself in an almost sickening way. She is eventually kidnapped and sold into work at the rear palace of the emperor and ends up working for one of his courtesans. Her expertise, coupled with an inability to look the other way, ends up getting her acquainted with Jinshi, a eunuch who seems to hold quite a bit of political sway. Jinshi seems quite taken by Mao Mao, who is quite the wild card in a world where everyone seems to have an agenda. He's fascinated by her, while Mao Mao is far more interested in poison and food testing than she will ever be in Jinshi. Despite being incredibly attractive and charismatic, Jinshi appears to have no effect beyond repellent for our dear Mao Mao, but they end up building a relationship of mutual usefulness and perhaps arguable friendship as they navigate a world completely foreign to the modern audience watching the show. Mao Mao is in glee as a food taster for courtesans in high power, testing for poisons in each meal that they receive, becoming most excited when she gets to experience the tingle of a deadly chemical in a bowl of soup. I'd like to move to talking about the music, because I found it to be personally quite striking. Let me just hit you with a fact about the OST that'll blow your mind. Spanning just under 3 hours in length across 77 tracks, the soundtrack is divided into 3 discs where one composer gets control of their own disc. First is Satoru Kosaki, the longest, accounting for 40% of the total runtime, known for the music of titles like The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, the Monogatari series, and Beastars. The second composer is Kevin Perkin, a British-born Australian composer known for the award-winning scores to Made in Abyss and Tower of God, among other things. And third is Arisa Okehazama, best known for composing the music to Jujutsu Kaisen and The God of High School. For a show that seems to have at least 3 different genres defining it, it only makes sense that there are 3 different composers working on a score that is as dynamic as the story and visual presentation. I would personally like to comment on some of Satoru Kosaki's tracks, as they are the ones that stick out most to me. For a show set in a fictional world influenced by China, it's no surprise that the music reminded me of the OST for my favorite video game of all time. From the first time I played it over a quarter of a century ago, Shenmue on the Dreamcast took my #1 spot and has yet to be dethroned even after all these years. Including the work of several Sega composers, the Shenmue soundtrack was full of sweeping orchestral themes, traditional East Asian-inspired melodies, and ambient environmental music of the aforementioned flavor, among many other styles. I noticed almost right away when I heard Apothecary Diaries songs like Food Taster and The Old Lady that reminded me of the tracks that accompanied Ryo Hazuki while he was exploring the basement of the Hazuki Dojo, or even in Shenmue 2 when Ryo was exploring Wanzai in Hong Kong. There was always a Chinese character to the story that began in Yokosuka, Japan, but I could undeniably hear it in Kosaki-san's soundtrack, whether or not he was influenced by the Sega music team that worked on Shenmue. If you're unfamiliar with both soundtracks, I really do encourage you to seek them out because they are entirely worth your time. Aside from the OST, the openings and endings of this 2-core season were really quite enjoyable. About half the time I reluctantly skipped the OP because of the sense of urgency the previous episode cliffhanger and preview created in me, but that in no way takes away from my opinion of the quality of the auditory bookends that we are graced with. There are a total of 4 songs in Season 1 that served as such, and I'd like to briefly touch on what I liked about them if you'll indulge me. The first opening was Hana ni Nate, or Become a Flower, by Ryoku Oshoku Shakai. This dynamic and high-energy song full of distorted guitars and double bass drumming, blended with visuals that show 2 contrasting sides of Mao Mao's actual character and, dare I say, potential, was also quite striking because of the vocalist. My first impression of Haruko Nagaya's performance is that she shares a vocal quality and timbre, in my opinion, with Shakira. Just pull this up on YouTube and I think you'll know what I mean. You might recognize Ryoku Shaka from other anime OPs and EDs like Delicious in Dungeon, My Hero, and Yashahime, Princess Half-Demon. The first ending is by Aina the End, whom I have become quite the fan of, and the song is called Aiko Toba. I freaking love her voice, and with the slower melody, it really captured a sense of melancholy that absolutely must exist for someone with a life experience of Mao Mao, despite her outwardly detached and ambivalent personality. Speaking of ambivalence, the second opening is fittingly called Ambivalent, and is by the artist Uru. The lyrics of this song, in my opinion, seem to fit the complicated nature of the relationship between Mao Mao and Jinshi, especially from the point of view of someone who is fascinated by an unusual person and admiring such an enigma from an emotional distance despite close proximity. The last ending for Season 1 of Apothecary Diaries is Ai wa Kusuri, or Love is Medicine, by the band Wachi. There's a depth to this one that defines the word bittersweet if you watch the ending animation back to back with the official music video. While writing this segment, I've been real back and forth about whether I wanted to discuss some spoilery aspects of the show, particularly regarding a character named Lakan, but I'm currently leaning towards not doing so. I will, rather, describe the emotions the final few episodes of the season elicited within me without diving into any details that might ruin the story for you if you've not watched the show. Sensing that my wife might one day enjoy watching this show, I chose to watch the final episodes with headphones on, and she noticed that I had become a bit tearful while watching. She asked me if the show had made me sad, and I said no, that they were happy sort of tears that follow a profound understanding of something in the past that cannot be changed, but ultimately found a positive resolution despite it not being the most ideal outcome. Bittersweet to the core. I found unlikable characters to develop endearing qualities despite their flaws, and I felt whisked into a sense of camaraderie with the most unexpected of people. There's a sense that characters in this highly restrictive and structured world are so much more than they seem to be, and upon reflection I came to realize that that might be what this story is all about, and it's not just limited to the main characters. It certainly goes without saying that I personally enjoyed Season 1 of Apothecary Diaries very much, and I think it's a pretty remarkable story that is propelled into worlds of depth by the rules of its setting. I have a daughter that will be born soon, so I've begun really thinking seriously about the sort of things that I enjoy and whether, if ever, I'd let her watch such things. I bring that up now to discuss the content rating of this show, because I don't find a lot to be personally objectionable, but I think one should have a certain level of maturity while watching a show like this. I think I disagree with Common Sense Media's 14+ rating, as some of the themes can be quite weighty, and the moral culture may not be suitable for such impressionable minds. I'm real back and forth about it, but it felt worth mentioning, as it's the sort of thing that I've been contemplating as a soon-to-be father. All that being said, I do recommend that people check out the first season of Apothecary Diaries, but I'm uncertain if I think it's suitable for younger audience. It's most certainly not for children. And now, I turn this to you. Are you a fan of this show? What do you think are the reasons that this OG-san and so many other fans kept coming back for more? Would you like to chime in on my final thoughts about the content warning that Crunchyroll has listed as 14+? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'd be happy to respond in a future video.
おじいさんのアニメクラブ
Tenchi Muyo, a title that both sparks many beloved memories for anime fans of my generation for expanding our horizons during the Toonami block, and also confusion for those who seek to dive deeper into this franchise with a sizable body of work. Alternate universes and cross-pollinated timelines will have you running out of pushpins and string on your corkboard trying to connect the dots. And I'm gonna vocally commit to one day tackling that rat's nest of continuity. But today, we're gonna be going back to the very beginning as I talk about the first Tenchi Muyo OVA that came out in 1992. Just in case anyone listening is unfamiliar with OVAs, I'd like to offer a brief history to express just how vital they were to anime history before streaming services offered instant access to any given genre of animation. OVA is an acronym for Original Video Animation. Back in the day, we used to call them OAVs, but whatever. The key word here is video. Unlike a television series, an OVA was not made for broadcast, and unlike a movie, it wasn't made for theaters. Rather, it was produced for home video release on video cassettes, laserdisc, and eventually DVDs. What this did was open up a world of freedom for creators. No television schedule with advertising slots making a story fit into 22 minutes, plus very little in the way of broadcast content restrictions. and this opened up an experimental playground for ambitious creators in the 80s. Studios could target fans directly and take bigger risks that allowed for the production of some of the medium's most memorable works, and Tenchi Muyo Ryo-Ohki falls into that category. But what exactly is Tenchi Muyo Ryo-Ohki? The OVA is a science fiction comedy about an ordinary teenager named Tenchi Masaki, whose quiet life at his family's rural shrine is turned upside down after he accidentally awakens a demon that was sealed away for centuries. Well, that's not exactly true. I don't think you could call her a demon, but what makes me laugh is that every time I try to describe an aspect of the show, I feel like I have to backpedal, because what seems to be the case never very often actually is the case. What happens at this rural shrine expands into a story with space pirates, alien royalty, advanced organic ship technology. Yes, chew on that for a minute. And the popularization of the harem genre with situational comedy and slice-of-life charm. I suppose you could write that on the back of a VHS cover, but it still doesn't really seem to fully capture what Tenchi Muyo is. And that's why I'm excited to dive into this segment of the Anime Club. As I was rewatching the OVAs, I found myself rewinding scenes and rewatching entire episodes because suddenly something unexplained was normal, and I found myself both accepting of such things, which lends to the quality of the production, and also confused, seeking understanding that regrettably was not always available. Perhaps you've heard me talk about buried exposition before. The first time I ever heard it was related to Lawrence Kasdan and Irvin Kershner in their handling of the challenges of getting an audience caught up to the state of the galaxy in the first Star Wars sequel, The Empire Strikes Back. History has shown, even just by this example, that good creators shouldn't stop the story to explain things. Mr. Kershner, who directed the film, is quoted as saying, "Every film has this problem, and I'd like to bury the exposition as much as possible." He allowed information to emerge organically through scenes that would clue the audience in on the setting's reality without using descriptive verbiage. I took the time to explain that because Tenchi Muyo Ryo-Ohki feels like a perfect example of burying the exposition exquisitely. Through character interactions and increasingly chaotic situations involving Tenchi, the viewer is able to piece together the general state of galactic affairs spanning thousands, yes, thousands of years in just 6 episodes. That being said, there was a 7th episode, if you want to call it that, The Night Before the Carnival, which was created after the OVA became a hit and serves as a bridge between it and the second OVA. How did we come to get Tenchi Muyo? Well, the general story on the internet goes that while working on the Bubblegum Crisis OVA for the animation studio AIC, Masaki Kajishima, chief animation director and character designer of Tenchi, and Hiroki Hayashi, the director, writer, and co-creator, started tossing around ideas for a lighter contrast to the aforementioned series' serious dystopian vibe. More comedy in place of the doom and gloom, and the novel idea that in the harem dynamic, the ordinary male would be surrounded by extremely powerful and remarkable females. I wouldn't want to leave the listeners with info that they could easily find on Wikipedia themselves, so I elected to do some deeper research for this segment to provide some concrete quotes and sources to hopefully get to the heart of what really was on these creators' minds. Courtesy of TenchiForum.com, I was able to watch a once-lost interview from creators of Tenchi Muyo from a not-for-sale promotional tape sent out by Pioneer that for a long time may have only been watched by Japanese Pioneer employees and video store owners in the early 90s. I was also able to get my hands on a collection of the first 5 years of the magazine Animerica, Anime and Manga Monthly, from 1992 to 1997, with relative interviews. I'm very excited to share what I've learned from such precious resources. In an interview with Animerica in 1994, Hayashi-sensei revealed that the seeds for what eventually became Tenchi Muyo came during an all-night sake-drinking brainstorm with Kajishima-sensei, who took their idea to ArtMic, an industry leader. ArtMic, which stood for Art and Modern Ideology for Creation, was the studio that worked in conjunction with AIC to produce Bubblegum Crisis and Golf Force, among other OVAs. After declining to pick up the project, the pair pitched the project to Pioneer LDC, who were searching for new stories to be featured in their upcoming OVA line, and the rest, as they say, is history. This podcast wouldn't be deserving of its name if I didn't give this OG-san tidbit. The article reaffirmed and reminded me of a culture when names from popular series would become in high demand among fans, who competed for the privilege to use them as personal nicknames on the internet. As the popularity of characters in Tenchi Muyo skyrocketed, it became fashionable for fans to append Ohki to their name, almost like an honorific defining Cabot status on IRC, or Internet Relay Chat for those who don't share the same privilege as me in being older than the World Wide Web. A few years after the referenced article, I remember quite a few folks who would tack on SSJ or Majin to their names as I spent many post-Toonami block evenings rolling dice in the AOL Arts and Entertainment chat rooms. Hayashi reveals in the interview the roles that each of them filled in the genesis of the subject of this segment. He explained that he was responsible for writing down and collecting their ideas, and Kajishima's job was to draw up the storyboards and submit them as a proposal to production companies. Regarding the plot, he said that it was inspired by Golf Force and Bubblegum Crisis almost as something that resembled a side story, or even a parody to both stories. Hayashi expressed that so many of the AIC anime were nothing more than combat stories with characterization tacked on, and that, quote, I wanted to do a show where the characters themselves would be the core of the story. I wanted to do something that had never been seen before, end quote. Apparently, the OVA wasn't originally designed to go for only 6 episodes, but the intention was rather to create a story which could go on indefinitely. But the sponsors weren't on board, so a conclusion was made on the 6th episode. Hayashi admits after a comment from the Animerica interviewer that the 5th and 6th episodes were very dense with many story elements. I'd like to comment on that by saying this might add to the intrigue and continued discussion by fans who dissected this show because there was just a lot of meat jam-packed in there. Hayashi-sensei says, quote, they're dense all right. You wouldn't believe the number of arguments that we had while we were making them. End quote. Part of me wishes I could go back in time to encourage the interviewer to push further and say, what sort of arguments? But alas, they moved on to discuss pacing. A bit later, when male voice casting was discussed, he did reveal that the content of one such heated argument regarding whether or not Tenchi's grandfather was just an ordinary man. In the first draft of the story, and even after they had begun actual recording, they did not realize until later that his grandfather was no longer the same character with whom they had started. I did find myself quite pleased as Hayashi discussed choosing dinner scenes over school scenes for Tenchi. It lends to the buried exposition comments that I made before as he says, quote, I had to content myself with the thought that the reasons are all there in the story, even if they're only implied. End quote. I was surprised to learn that before the OVA was even animated, there was a drama CD released, which Hayashi confirms meant the plot was already written up by that point. He seemed to have a special affection for drama CDs, as they aren't hindered by the physical limitations of anime, and allow him to capture the atmosphere of the series in a much shorter amount of time than with a visual accompaniment. I find that to be very interesting, and I honestly wonder about that. To a degree, I suppose I would have to agree with him, but there are so many iconic moments in this OVA that I will never forget, and I would also never have been able to imagine that with just a vocal performance in my headphones. My most recent viewing of the first Tenchi Muyo Ryo-Ohki OVA was enjoyed with the Japanese dub and English subtitles, which was the first time that I had watched it in this format. I thought that it was very well done, and surprisingly it increased my appreciation for the English dub, because I think the adaptation was actually pretty close to the source material. That is based on memory, of course, but I didn't feel surprised by any of the original performances in comparison to my experience with their English counterparts. Speaking of the Japanese language, I realize now that I haven't discussed the complexity of the title of this anime. As the lost video interview on the Pioneer promo tape alluded to by acknowledging the pun, there are multiple ways one could translate Tenchi Muyo. Let's start with a literal translation. Tenchi can be broken up into ten, or heaven, and chi, or earth. Muyo can mean useless or unnecessary, but to align with the title of other adaptations of this story, we'll call it No Need. Put them together and what have you got? No need for heaven and earth. Ryoko is having a conversation with Tenchi-kun in a promo video following the Pioneer interview with both creators where she encourages him to stay firm so that they will stop calling him Tenchi Muyo, to which he responds, "Do you mean don't turn things upside down?" And Ryoko responds, "Oh, so that's what it means." The joke here is that Tenchi Muyo is also a phrase traditionally printed on shipping crates in Japan, conveying this side up or handle with care, do not turn upside down. A little more depth into the pun puts heaven and earth in their correct positions and encourages one to not put them in the wrong order or upside down. Upon watching the OVA, the viewer will learn that Tenchi is not just the name of the protagonist, but also a sword that truly expands the mythological aspect of the story being told. So what more shall we say about the story of the first 6 episodes of Tenchi that grew into such an enormous franchise spanning nearly 180 episodes, depending on who you ask, and 5 hours of movies? Well, I'd like to take a look at how each episode evolved at a breakneck pace, though not jarringly so, and then touch on a couple of curiosities that I took note of before I give my final thoughts and recommendation. The first episode, Ryoko Resurrected, is heavy on folklore. Before the viewer realizes that this premise is actually misleading, we hear about a legendary samurai ancestor, a demon imprisoned for 700 years, and a mystical sword that Tenchi seems to be able to use instinctively. The second episode, Here Comes Ayeka, shifts from folklore to space opera, as we get a princess from another planet called Jirai seeking her missing brother. The viewer at first might be asking themselves, why or how is the heir of a galactic empire connected to a rural Japanese shrine? Episode 3, Hello Ryo-Ohki, is where we meet a cute cat rabbit who is both an animal and a spaceship. Shh, just go with it. What's astonishing is that we've gone from folklore to space opera to unusual science fiction where technology meets biology in just 3 episodes. Episode 4, entitled Mihoshi Falls to the Land of Stars, introduces us to a ditzy galactic police officer who crashes, in all senses of the word, into the cast. Now we learn that there is a police force that patrols the galaxy, and also that the supposed demon from Episode 1 is famous across all of space, and that Jirai is not the only major power in the galaxy. Episode 5 starts shifting so quickly that if you blink, you'll miss a lot. Kagato Attacks introduces the villain who has power and seeks ownership over Ryoko, who before seemed understandably OP. Not only is Ryoko not a demon, nor is she merely a space pirate, but she is actually a creation with engineered powers by someone important that we don't meet until the final episode of the OVA. Episode 6, called We Need Tenchi, or Tenchi Hitsuyo, dances around the show title's punny nature. We meet Washu in such a surprising way as Mihoshi accidentally enters what the Stranger Things generation might call the upside down of Kagato's ship. This mysterious prisoner is none other than the self-proclaimed greatest scientific genius in the universe, who is connected to nearly every major mystery that you've been watching in the previous 5 episodes. Through dialogue, we learn that Kagato was an assistant to Washu, as he referred to her as Sensei. The scope of this story's history multiplies even beyond Ryoko's 700-year imprisonment, when he says, "Do you assume I haven't learned anything in the last 5,000 years? And there you have it. You are learning all of these things alongside Tenchi Masaki, who is just as clueless as the audience as each shocking event compounds upon another. And what we're left with is an OVA that has all the depth of a 2-core series without unnecessary lore dumps. When you really think about what it was able to accomplish in around 3 hours, Tenchi Muyo Ryo-Ohki is quite a remarkable specimen in the history of anime. When I call the OVA to mind, I imagine the opening theme first and foremost with its bells and its unstoppable fretless bass line. I then think of Ryoko's eyes as she first brushes past Tenchi on the rooftop of his school, and then I hear her scream when she thinks that Tenchi has been killed and all the sand in her hourglass prison is tornadoed up as she frantically searches for his body in the vacuum of space. Ayeka's shrill scream of "Yah!" that precedes this by seconds also sends chills up my spine. There are so many iconic moments and memorable interactions that make this show unforgettable in my personal opinion. And I think it's very safe to say that this OVA is absolutely vital, not just in the history of OVAs, but also of anime at large. There are a few problems, though, that I absolutely cannot skip over. If you're listening to this segment in order on the podcast, you just heard me discuss the content rating of Apothecary Diaries, and so it's fitting that I bring up the fact that there is quite a bit of explicit content in this OVA that makes it wholly unsuitable for some audiences. Though there is no blatant sexual activity in this show, there are multiple hot spring scenes where almost all of the females are portrayed with full frontal nudity. This is a perfect example of what could separate an OVA from a broadcasted anime, and it puts me in mind of Initial D's OVAs versus the broadcasted show as an alternate example. Depending on who you are, you may be able to view such scenes as artistic rather than sexualized, but that's a very fine line to skirt, and so, with the full intent to avoid steering anyone in the wrong direction, I can't in good faith recommend anyone watch this show due to the excessive amount of nudity in it. Please use your own judgment when determining this for yourself. And with that, I think we've covered the first Tenchi Muyo OVA pretty well. I hope you've enjoyed the opinions, the memories, the lost sources, and deeply shelved interviews, and if so, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the matter. Who is your favorite character in Tenchi Muyo, and why is it Ryoko? Jokes aside, please share with me your thoughts in the comments below, and I'd be happy to respond to them in a future video. There's plenty more Tenchi where this came from. In fact, I have all of Universe, Tenchi in Tokyo, and GXP on DVD on my anime shelf, plus a couple of the movies, so if you'd like to hear about one in particular ahead of the others, I'll happily take that into account. Let me know!
おじいさんのアニメクラブ
Alright Nakama, we're going to come to a close on episode 4 of the podcast now. I picked up a couple of new Blu-rays recently, first being the complete series of heavy metal L Gaim, the groundbreaking 1984 mecha anime created by Yoshiyuki Tomino of Mobile Suit Gundam fame, and with iconic character and mechanical designs by Mamoru Nagano. It went on to directly inspire Nagano's later masterpiece, The 5-Star Stories, and is an absolute standout in real robot anime history. I'm taking my time with the series, but I have no doubt I'll be discussing it one day on a future segment. Also, in my excitement of researching Tenchi Muyo Ryo-Ohki, I picked up the complete series Blu-ray of Bubblegum Crisis. If you have anything you'd like to say about either of those series, now would be a good time to get those comments in. You can leave them on Spotify, YouTube, or send emails and voicemails to ogsansanimeclub@gmail.com. Besides commenting, I invite you to please subscribe as well, if for no other reason than it's the only way to find out what happens on the next exciting episode of OG-san's Anime Club.
楽しいだまたね
Yeah!